Emily Carter's life wasn't just ruined, it was stolen. One moment she was a devoted wife, the next she was handcuffed, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Daniel Carter was missing, presumed dead. The police didn't hesitate, they didn't question, they pointed fingers. The evidence? Airtight. The motive? A textbook case of betrayal. The verdict? Sealed before she could even grasp what was happening. But there was one problem, one devastating, impossible flaw. Daniel was alive, watching, smiling, letting his wife take the fall. And when Emily uncovered the truth, the law wasn't enough. Justice wasn't enough. She wanted something more. She wanted him to suffer. This is the true story of deception so twisted it destroyed a life, and the stunning moment when Emily got her chance for revenge. Stay with us, because this one will leave you questioning just how well you know the people closest to you. Emily's brush hovered over the canvas, but her mind wasn't on the painting. It was on the fractures in Daniel's perfect facade. The hesitation in his voice when he said, "just a work thing," the way his fingers tightened around his phone, the perfume, floral, unfamiliar, clinging to his collar like a whispered confession. The late nights, the missed calls. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof. Proof of something rotten beneath the surface. She painted because it was the only thing in her life that didn't deceive her. The colors never lied. But Daniel did. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Emily sat at the dining table, the untouched dinner cooling on her plate. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, the lock clicked. The front door creaked open. Footsteps, uneven and heavy. The scent of whiskey filled the air before he even spoke. Emily didn't move, didn't breathe. Daniel had come home, and tonight she needed answers. The storm outside mirrored the tempest raging within Emily. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a wounded animal. She stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Daniel's phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another message from her. Emily's stomach twisted. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible." The sender? Not her, not his wife, Sophie. The door creaked open. The scent of whiskey arrived first, then Daniel. Emily lifted the phone, the screen glowing like a pulsing wound between them. "Who is she?" Daniel's eyes flicked to the door, a silent calculation, an escape plan forming, but there was nowhere to run. "Don't even try it," Emily warned, her voice carved from ice. His mouth opened, reaching for the usual lies. "Emily, you're being dramatic." The phone flew from her hand, shattering against the table. His flinch was all the confirmation she needed. "Don't you dare." The words came low, measured. His hands twitched, his next excuse already forming. Emily cut him off before it left his lips. "No more games, Daniel. Tell me her name." He reached for her, his hands grasping at her arms. "Please, let's talk about this." The room blurred, red-hot rage twisting through Emily's veins. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the years of stolen time, the humiliation, the lies stacking higher and higher until they crashed down in this single moment. She didn't think, she moved. The knife was in her hand before she even realized she'd grabbed it. "Emily, wait." She swung, a blind, desperate arc. The blade met flesh. Daniel gasped, his hands flying to his side, blood blooming between his fingers. Shock, fear, the widening of his eyes as he stumbled backward, colliding with the table. Emily staggered, her grip loosening. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. Silence, except for their breathing. Ragged, uneven. And then, Daniel's knees buckled. Prison didn't just erase her, it reduced her. A number stitched into fabric. Days marked by footsteps on concrete, nights that never ended. Murderer. They whispered it, scratched it into the walls. It didn't matter if it was true. The world had already moved on. But Emily, she was trapped in a past she couldn't escape. Emily tried to block out the noise, to focus on the one thing that kept her sane, her art. With a stub of charcoal and scraps of paper, she poured her pain onto the page, creating haunting images of the life she had lost. Her hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with the weight of her guilt. One day, a new inmate arrived, a woman named Maria, whose sharp eyes and quick wit reminded Emily of herself. Maria took one look at Emily's drawings and nodded in approval. "You've got talent," she said. "Don't let this place take that from you." Their friendship became a lifeline for Emily, a reminder that she was more than the crime she had committed. But even Maria couldn't erase the nightmares that plagued her sleep. Visions of Daniel's bloodied body, his accusing eyes staring up at her. Emily sat on the edge of her narrow prison cot, the letter clutched tightly in her hands. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she had read them enough times to memorize every detail. The journalist, a woman named Claire Harper, had uncovered evidence that Daniel was alive. The letter was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed her for 15 years. Emily's hands trembled as she reread the final paragraph. "I believe you were wrongfully convicted. If you're willing, I'd like to help you prove it." For the first time in years, Emily felt something other than despair. It was a flicker of anger, hot and sharp, cutting through the numbness that had settled over her. Daniel had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and now he was living a life of luxury while she rotted in a cell. The injustice of it burned in her chest, fueling a determination she hadn't felt in years. Claire Harper arrived at the prison a week later, her sharp eyes scanning the visiting room with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too much. She was in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail and a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. When Emily sat down across from her, Claire didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been investigating your case," Claire said, pulling a folder from her bag, "and I think there's enough evidence to get you a new trial." Emily's heart raced as Claire spread the documents across the table. There were photos of Daniel, alive and well, living in a small town under the name David Miller. He had a new wife, a new life, and no trace of the man Emily had once loved. Emily's fingers curled into fists. "He let me rot in that cell." Her voice was steady, her rage wasn't. Claire met her eyes. "Then let's make him pay." The legal battle was long and grueling. Claire worked tirelessly to gather evidence, while Emily's lawyer filed motion after motion to have her case reopened. The media caught wind of the story, and soon Emily's face was plastered across newspapers and TV screens. "Woman wrongfully convicted of husband's murder seeks justice," the headlines screamed. Emily hated the attention, but she knew it was necessary. The public outcry put pressure on the courts, and after months of hearings, a judge finally agreed to review her case. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel's fingerprints on documents, eyewitness accounts of his new life, and even a confession from a former accomplice who had helped him fake his death. When the judge overturned her conviction, Emily felt a mix of relief and disbelief. She was free. But the world outside the prison walls felt foreign and overwhelming. Claire met her at the gates, a small smile on her face. "What now?" Emily asked, squinting in the sunlight. Claire handed her a folder. "Now we find Daniel?" Emily's first days of freedom were a blur. She stayed in a small apartment Claire had arranged for her, the walls bare and the furniture sparse. It was a far cry from the life she had once known, but it was hers. She spent hours poring over the documents Claire had given her, memorizing every detail of Daniel's new life. But adjusting to freedom wasn't easy. The world had changed in 15 years, and Emily felt like a stranger in her own skin. She jumped at loud noises, avoided crowded places, and struggled to sleep without the familiar hum of the prison around her. Claire became her anchor, helping her navigate the complexities of life outside. One evening, as they sat in the apartment going over the case, Claire asked the question that had been weighing on Emily's mind. "What are you going to do when you find him?" Emily looked up, her eyes hard. "I'm going to make him pay." Daniel Miller, formerly Daniel Carter, stood on the porch of his suburban home, a cup of coffee in his hand. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the neatly trimmed lawn, and the sound of living the life that should have been hers. She clenched her jaw and pushed the thought aside. There was no room for sentimentality now. She crept down the hallway, her breath shallow and her heart racing. The sound of laughter grew louder as she approached the living room. She paused at the doorway, her hand gripping the knife in her coat pocket. Daniel and Sarah were on the couch, their heads close together as they shared a private joke. Emily's chest tightened as she watched them. The sight of Daniel's smile, so familiar, yet so foreign, sending a wave of rage through her. "Daniel," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. Both of them froze, their laughter dying in an instant. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock as he saw her standing there. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah looked between them, confusion etched on her face. "David, who is this?" Emily stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Tell her, Daniel. Tell her who I am." Daniel rose slowly, hands raised, more for himself than for her. "Emily, we can fix this." She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Fix this?" Sarah, still seated, eyes darting between them, whispered, "David, who is she?" Emily turned to her, gaze cold. "He hasn't told you?" "Of course not." "That's what he does. He lies. He builds a new life, a new woman, and when she's served her purpose, he moves on. Just like he did with me." Daniel took a cautious step forward. "Emily, listen." "No, you listen." Her voice hardened. "I spent 15 years behind bars because of you. 15 years while you played house with your next victim. How does it feel, Daniel, knowing you finally ran out of places to hide?" Daniel's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Emily took another step forward, her hand tightening around the knife. "Tell her the truth, Daniel. Tell her who you really are." Daniel's fingers twitched toward his pocket. A last, desperate instinct. A wasted one. Sarah's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who is she?" Emily tilted her head. "Tell her, Daniel. Or should I?" Daniel swallowed. "Sarah, No," Emily snapped. "You're out of names, out of lies. Now tell her the truth." Daniel took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "My name isn't David Miller. It's Daniel Carter. And this is my ex-wife, Emily." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "What are you talking about? You told me your ex-wife was dead." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Dead? Is that what he told you?" "No, Sarah. I'm very much alive. And I've spent the last 15 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Because of him." Sarah turned to Daniel, her voice shaking. "Is this true? Did you fake your death?" Daniel couldn't meet her eyes. "I had to, Sarah. I was in trouble, and I didn't know what else to do." Sarah stumbled back, her face pale. "You lied to me. All these years you've been lying to me." Emily stepped forward, her voice cold. "He's a liar and a coward, Sarah, and now he's going to pay for what he's done." Daniel's eyes darted to the knife in Emily's hand, his face twisting in fear. "Emily, please, don't do this." "Don't do this?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You ruined my life, Daniel. You took everything from me, and now you think you can just walk away?" She lunged at him, the knife flashing in the dim light. Daniel stumbled back, his hands raised to defend himself. But he was too slow. The blade sank into his side, and he let out a strangled cry. Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. "Stop! Please stop!" Emily turned to her, her eyes blazing. "You think you're innocent in all this? You're just another pawn in his game. Sarah backed away, her hands raised in surrender. "I didn't know, I swear. Please, don't hurt me." But Emily was beyond reason. The years of pain, betrayal, and anger had boiled over, and there was no stopping her now. She lunged at Sarah, the knife finding its mark. The room was filled with screams, the sound of flesh tearing, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. When it was over, Emily stood amidst the carnage, her chest heaving and her hands slick with blood. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The room was silent now, save for the sound of her ragged breathing. She looked down at Daniel's lifeless body, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. For a moment, she felt a pang of regret, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. Finally, it was over. Sarah lay nearby, her body crumpled and still. Emily felt no remorse for her. She had been collateral damage, a casualty of Daniel's lies, but as the adrenaline faded, the weight of what she had done began to sink in. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Emily knew she didn't have much time. She took one last look at the room, at the life she had destroyed, and then turned and walked out the door. The police found her standing in the rain, her hands stained with blood and her eyes hollow. She didn't resist as they cuffed her, didn't speak as they read her rights. She had done what she aimed to do, and now she would face the consequences. As they led her to the squad car, she looked up at the sky, the rain washing away the blood on her hands. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. The nightmare was over, and she was finally free. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Emily sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked calm, but inside, her heart was racing. Emily sat still, her hands clasped, her breath steady. On the screen before her, her life dissected, frame by frame. Crime scene photos, blood-stained evidence bags, a gruesome slideshow of a moment she never planned, but one she wouldn't take back. She wasn't grieving, the prosecutor sneered. She was waiting, plotting, hunting for revenge. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone gasped, someone whispered. Laura Bennett, her attorney, rose, a slow, measured movement, a pause before she spoke. She didn't stalk him, she didn't hunt him down. She found out he was alive, the man who let her rot in prison for 15 years. And she reacted. I ask you, who among us wouldn't? Silent. 3 days. That's how long the jury deliberated. Then, finally, we find the defendant guilty of manslaughter in the second degree. A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom. Emily inhaled sharply. She wasn't walking free, but she wasn't doomed either. The judge spoke next. Emily Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. 7 more years before she could breathe free air. Her eyes met Claire's across the courtroom. The journalist nodded once, a silent promise. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Emily adjusted to life in prison once again, but this time it was different. She wasn't the broken woman she had been before. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and come out stronger on the other side. She spent her days painting, her art a reflection of her journey. Her work was dark and haunting, but also filled with hope. She found solace in the act of creation, in the knowledge that she could still make something beautiful out of the wreckage of her life. Claire visited her often, bringing books and news from the outside world. You've become a symbol, Claire said one day, her voice filled with admiration. People are inspired by your story, by your strength. Emily smiled faintly. I didn't do it to inspire anyone. I just wanted to survive. Years later, Emily stepped through the gates. The world had moved on. She had 7 years to figure that out. She moved to a small town, far from the memories that haunted her. She opened a studio, teaching art to troubled teens and survivors of abuse. Her story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward. One day, as she stood in her studio, a young woman approached her. "Are you Emily Carter?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily nodded. "I am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said. "Your story gave me the strength to leave my abuser. You saved my life." Emily felt a lump in her throat as she hugged the woman. "You saved yourself," she said softly. "I just showed you that it was possible." As the years passed, Emily's legacy grew. She became a symbol of resilience, of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest of betrayals. And though the scars of her past would never fully heal, she knew that she had found redemption, not in the eyes of the world, but in her own heart. Emily Carter's story is a chilling reminder of how far betrayal can push someone and the deadly consequences that follow. But this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a warning about the darkness that can hide behind the perfect facade. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're as captivated by this twisted tale as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more shocking, true crime stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, lies, and justice. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.